The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Can you all see my screen? There it is. Good morning. Sorry about the delay in getting started. My name's Genevieve Bennett. I'm joining you from Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace, along with Julia Baker from Balfour Beatty and George Kelly from RES. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Trent Lethco, was unable to join us this morning, but we will do our best without him. In terms of the structure of this webinar, we will start with presentations by myself, Julia, and George, followed by some time for Q&A. For those of you who aren't familiar with this webinar software, all participants are muted by default, so we don't have too much background noise. You should be able to follow along on your screen the PowerPoint presentation. And if you have any questions, you can submit them via the question box on your control panel. Feel free to send in questions at any point during the presentation, and then we will gather them in on this side and run through them as many as we can at the end of the webinar. So the goal for the webinar today is to look at the current state and scope of biodiversity mitigation globally through the lens of this kind of infrastructure tsunami that we're facing in the 21st century. And then hear from our panelists on their work and perspectives on how mitigation can be a really useful tool to ensure no net loss and to increase the pace and funding for biodiversity conservation, and also some of the challenges in scaling up those mitigation approaches. I will be reviewing some of the findings from a report that Forest Trends recently has released that myself and my colleagues Melissa Gallant and Carrie Tenkate have been working on, and I wanted to recognize them here today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ecosystem Marketplace or Forest Trends is a conservation NGO based in Washington, D.C. that works internationally to advance mechanisms for innovative conservation finance and environmental markets for forests, wetlands, watersheds, and other critical ecosystems. And Ecosystem Marketplace is its sort of information wing and platform. We offer news coverage, data and analytics, regular news briefings, and other market intelligence on environmental markets and conservation finance. And to set this stage, one of the reasons that we are really interested in biodiversity mitigation is that we are, all of us, living through the biggest building spree in human history today in terms of infrastructure, and traditional conservation strategies like protected areas and indigenous territories are having a really hard time keeping up. So on this map, this is just to sort of provide a little bit of background and context. These are some of the major current global infrastructure systems. So think of roads, power lines, railroads, ports, mines, fiber optic lines are those bands you see crossing the oceans, pipelines, coastal protections, and so on. And this is just current infrastructure. If we want to keep pace with current demand and make sure that everybody on the planet achieves a basic modern standard of living, we're going to have to double our spending on infrastructure by 2030 to about $6 trillion a year, and 2/3 of that is needed in developing countries. And so we can zoom in to a country like Brazil, which is grappling with this problem right now. Brazil's made a lot of progress on establishing protected areas in indigenous territories. Those are those green shapes you see on the map here. But here is the issue. You've got your major dams, you've got oil and gas pipelines, railways and roads and power lines and ports and mining concessions and so on. And you can see the good news, which is that most of this is happening outside of those green protected areas. But the bad news is that most of this is happening outside of those green protected areas, right? So traditional approaches are in some ways, a limited tool for keeping up with this infrastructure tsunami. And one way to make sure that biodiversity conservation can keep up with development is to bake biodiversity right into the development planning process so that you're not working around these projects or trying to play catch up with their impacts, but instead mainstreaming biodiversity goals right into planning and permitting. And the mitigation hierarchy, which is what you're looking at here on the screen, is one really promising way to do that. The idea is that every time you're putting in, for example, a pipeline or a road, you look at the impacts on species and habitats. And step one, you assess those impacts. Step two, can you avoid any of those? Step three on the chart, after you've avoided what you can, maybe you've moved the road, can you minimize whatever impacts remain? Step four, are there restoration opportunities? And then finally, after you have avoided and minimized and restored, you look at offsetting as your last resort option. And a sort of a flat-footed definition of offsets is that you're recreating or restoring or protecting similar or more valuable habitat elsewhere, so that in the big picture there's no net loss of biodiversity, and depending on your offset requirements, there can even be net gain. And so if this sounds really complicated or like a nice idea in theory, but not going to happen in practice, it actually has been in practice all over the world. And our work that I'm going to talk about now is taking a look at how that's working. Our most recent report focuses on that last step of offsetting or compensation, although Forest Trends, through its Biodiversity Initiative and the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, or BBOP, has done a lot of work on the preceding steps. But today we're looking really in particular at where a third party is providing that mitigation rather than the permitting necessarily doing it themselves, because this is sort of the restoration economy, right? You can make a living doing it, and there's evidence that it's possible to support a whole new industry providing ecological restoration. So the business and biodiversity offsets has, as I mentioned, helped to formulate and advance international consensus on best practice for offsetting, as well as the standard and guidelines. Going through, the principles, the standard, and the guidelines would require multiple additional webinars in and of themselves, but I would encourage you to take a look at these materials to better understand the larger picture in which this report was developed. In terms of our report methodology, we collected data through a survey, through phone and email interviews, and through a lot of desk research. Transparency is a constant challenge in this space. I'll talk about that more. And then a few other notes. We report actual transactions except for the US, where we had sufficient price and volume data to estimate overall annual value. And we do only report data points where we have at least 3 within sort of a given category in order to protect the confidentiality of our survey respondents. So onto the findings. The first part of the report includes a scan of active and developing policies requiring compensatory mitigation and the use of the mitigation hierarchy. Right now we see 33 countries with national or subnational compliance frameworks on the books. That being said, only about a third of those policies actually triggered mitigation transactions in 2016, suggesting that maybe regulators aren't using them very consistently, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. I am going to focus mainly on compliance, offsets, and compensation today, since we do track relatively few voluntary initiatives, although they're out there and they're really interesting. We spend some time on those in our report if that's of interest to any of you in the audience. And so we estimate there were at least $4.8 billion in transactions last year. The last time we did a global estimate like this was in 2011, so that 2016 value represents roughly a doubling of estimated annual global value. Not all of this money made it to the ground in 2016. We're seeing in a number of countries that the funds are kind of just sitting there, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. This is also only a fraction of actual spending. These are just transactions to third-party providers, mitigation banks, and compensation funds. The majority of land area that we see being conserved by offsets and compensation are permitted responsible or one-off offsets. And so there's a lot of additional value out there that's more difficult for us to track. And then finally, this is just direct transactions for offsets. We're not even looking at other economic activity in terms of jobs created and value added to the economy. There was one study that came out a few years ago estimating that the compensatory mitigation industry in the United States probably generates about $25 billion a year in direct and indirect impacts. So looking at who is paying for mitigation, these are the top 5 buyers by land area for newly initiated projects last year. You can see that transportation and shipping sector is the biggest source of demand for compensatory mitigation, although in terms of the average and median transaction sizes, the energy and mining and material sectors tend to have kind of a bigger footprint. By contrast, commercial and residential development, which we've collapsed here into a single category, on average is looking to offset much smaller impacts and plays a kind of a varying role depending on where you look in the world in terms of being a source of demand. And again, that's something we discuss more in the report itself. On the supply side, again, lots of variation by region. In many parts of the world, offsets and compensation are, we see them tending to be used to fund public lands restoration and protection. In North America and Oceania, Australia in particular, which are places where there's a relatively higher level of third-party mitigation, you can see there's a lot more engagement by private landowners who see offsets and compensation provision as a business opportunity. In the US, we find the biggest market in the world, and that is for wetland and stream credits. By volume of credit sales, we've seen an average of 18% growth annually since 2010. Most of those mitigation banks are run by private companies, and hopefully George Kelly, who will be speaking later in the hour, can talk a little bit more about that industry. Switching over to compensation funds, which are usually operated by the public sector or by NGOs, we do find some kind of mixed news. Funds took in, we tracked at least $1.2 billion last year, but they're not always spending it. You see that $7.1 billion circled on the table here. That is the fund balance that is sort of sitting there that funds reported. And it's a serious issue because if funds are taking in money for impacts that have already occurred, but not immediately funding mitigation, that means we're accumulating net loss of biodiversity, right? We found examples of this in Brazil, in India, in Australia, and there is a fix. It's just a matter of designing your policy, right, to make sure that funds are required to move faster in developing projects. We also collected price data, and so we present average credit prices and ranges in the report for some commonly transacted credit types rolled up at the state or local market level. Here you are looking at wetland credits transacted in the U.S. Wetland Compensatory Mitigation Program. And you can take a look at the report where we summarize 2016 prices for some other major mitigation markets listed here on the screen. We also asked a smaller sample of mitigation banks and compensation funds, or they're known as in lieu fee programs in the US, to tell us kind of approximately how different components of mitigation project development are contributing to overall project costs. And so what you're looking at here on the screen is kind of the overall average anatomy of different costs. They vary a lot. Again, this is just the average. So local land cost, for instance, is probably the single biggest determinant of credit pricing, since land costs can vary so much by geography. But also, you can consider that like a wetland restoration project is probably going to have relatively higher site work costs than a wetland preservation project, right, that's focused on protecting existing high quality habitat. The time and the cost associated with regulatory permitting also can have a really strong influence on overall project costs. In California, for example, state regulators require a $100,000 application fee for proposed mitigation banks. And, time is money, right? So depending on how long regulatory approval takes, that can also add to your costs, as can your obligations in terms of maintenance and monitoring and long-term stewardship. We also looked at some data collected for another report that Forest Trends has put out, the State of Private Investment and Conservation, and pulled out data specifically related to investments in mitigation banking. One finding there is that almost all capital committed by private investors in mitigation banking reported an expected internal rate of return of between 10 and 25%. That was a significantly higher projected yield than other habitat conservation investments that we track, and that's likely a reflection of the relatively higher risks associated with banking. But in terms of actual performance, investors are also reporting to us that 2/3 of the capital committed to mitigation banks between 2009 and 2015 delivered on projected IRR, and 20% exceeded expectations. And again, that outperforms the broader kind of category of habitat conservation investments overall that we track, which was an interesting finding. And so I talked, shifting back kind of to the bigger picture, I talked in the beginning about those permitting responsible offsets and mitigation. And I do want to point out that this is where our ability to track these mechanisms kind of hits a wall. When you look at total land area being managed through offsets and compensation globally, just 3% of that in our data was coming from banks and compensation funds. The rest were all permitting responsible offsets. There's one really big mega project in Mongolia that's more than 5 million hectares, and that weighs our data pretty heavily. But even when you exclude that, we're still probably looking at about 2/3 of kind of the mitigation universe being provided by permittees themselves. And the problem there is that there's typically very little public transparency around these. It's sometimes hard to uncover what they're doing, how much they're investing, what management in the long term is looking like, what performance is looking like. And so, I think that $4.8 billion is really just kind of the tip of the iceberg when you think about how much is actually being spent out there. But as of right now, the public doesn't have a whole lot of oversight. And so one thing, I think coming out of this report that we'd really like to see is improvements in terms of what mitigation projects, not just permitting responsible, but across the board, all mitigation projects are required to disclose to make sure that they're performing as expected, to make sure that all these projects are being held to the same standards. And, because I think that biodiversity offsets have been pretty controversial at times, and when they're operating within a black box, that obviously that's really not helpful. So I'm about to wrap up. A few final comments. You'll remember I mentioned that only about 1/3 of the offset and compensation programs that we tracked posted actual activity in 2016. The optimistic interpretation there, I think, is, maybe these programs, the mitigation hierarchy is working, right? The programs are fully addressing their impacts through avoidance and minimization and rehabilitation, and so they just aren't needing offsets. I think the more likely explanation is probably that these policies either aren't being enforced or they're happening in a black box, and there isn't really any effort to be, made to make this information available to the public. Either way, I think maybe we've gone off the rails. And one thing, that I think we're picking up on is that from people that we're talking to is that policy and legislation as it's written is often ambiguous, or there isn't clear guidance on implementation. And in practice, what that does is it kind of makes it effectively optional, right? Regulators might, for example, only require mitigation for really large, highly visible private sector projects. And so one tool that the Biodiversity Initiative has been working on is a no net loss roadmap guiding policy, and what that needs to look like to develop a really effective policy. On the transparency front, I mentioned, that this is a continuing obstacle. We are seeing efforts to improve transparency, particularly in the US for mitigation banking and in the fee programs and some programs in Australia, but it's really uneven. And we discussed some of those efforts in the regional section of the report. I think that Ribbits in the US is a nice example of how this can work, right? We'd like to see public registries for mitigation transactions and projects across all mitigation types. I think the public also needs access to data on whether projects are meeting performance standards and what those standards are, and ideally monitoring data and things like that, not just the initial project or permit approval and then kind of no follow-up. And then finally, I did want to highlight one global trend, which is that we are seeing lending institutions integrating no net loss requirements into their lending requirements, and that's happening within some major infrastructure and development finance institutions, and it's really exciting. It is, it's still, we're seeing a relatively small amount of activity, but we do expect that to scale up in the coming years. There's a lot more in the full report. Again, I would encourage you to take a look. We have a lot of sort of basic, biodiversity 101, biodiversity mitigation 101. We talk more about policy design and project design. We have a lot more detail regionally. We have a special case on barriers to scaling up private investment mitigation and a number of case examples of mitigation projects. So thank you all. Oh my gosh, I forgot to add the link there. I apologize. We will send that around in the follow-up email on this webinar. But I would encourage you to get in touch with me or the other authors on the report if you have any questions or thoughts on next steps. And next up, we have Julia Baker, who's a biodiversity technical specialist with Balfour Beatty, and she's going to talk about some of their experience and perspectives on the topic of biodiversity mitigation. So Julia, we are going to hand things off to you now. I apologize. We are having a few technical difficulties, it sounds like. So I think what we're going to do while things get sorted out on Julia's end is have George Kelly speak, if that's all right with you, George.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Happy to go whenever.
Step in. Great.
And you'll put the slides up?
Yes. They should be showing now.
I don't see them on my end, but there we go. Okay. Good morning, and thank you much, Jen, and thank you for Ecosystem Marketplace and Forest Trends and Bebop for the opportunity to comment. Briefly, in the next slide, I'm the Chief Market Officer for Resource Environmental Solutions, and we're the leading ecological offset provider in the U.S. With offices in 14 states and operations in over 20 states. We have over 400 dedicated individuals across the country working on offset and water resource solutions. The next slide, Jen. So you can see relative to kind of the work we're doing in the U.S. in particular, we're involved with wetland and stream mitigation. We've done over 42,000 acres of wetland restoration and over 200 miles of stream restoration. We're involved with species mitigation under the Endangered Species Act, water quality trading and stormwater solutions, buffer mitigation, and ecological restoration as well. Next slide. So briefly, relative to kind of the role of ecosystem marketplace and this report, as Jen mentioned, it's kind of the first update on the biodiversity market since 2011. I can't emphasize enough how important data is to our marketplace, and the role that ecosystem marketplace has played has been fantastic in trying to enlighten the marketplace plus policymakers. Just to give you a sense, in the early days, prior to the 2008 U.S. federal mitigation rule that was adopted as a result of law that was passed in 2003 by the U.S. Congress, a lot of effort was put together and data that was very helpful from the ecosystem marketplace. There was very few places to turn about the breadth of the market, some of the issues associated with that, the data behind that. So it's an essential role, and I thank you and kudos to the ecosystem marketplace team and Bebop and Forest Trends for putting out this report. Next slide, please. So the other thing is, as Jen mentioned, we can't forget that we're in the context of the restoration economy. When too often people are pitting these kind of offset solutions versus the economy, and I think it's really important to understand that we are part, at least at this moment, based on a study that was done by Todd Van Door and academics and others that was published in 2015, that suggests that the restoration economy, both direct and indirect, is over $25 billion a year. And that includes employment, direct employment of 126,000 people a year, and indirect employment of another 95,000, for a total of over 221,000 jobs. And when you do the analysis, I think they've suggested that there are 33 jobs produced per $1 million spent, which is significant. Indeed, they're also suggesting there's an employment multiplier of anywhere from 1.5 to 3.8 for the work being done. So the context, this biodiversity offset market report is in the context of the overall restoration economy, and I think it's important that we recognize that. Next slide. So relative to the report, as you saw and heard from Jen, it's approximately $5 billion a year. I think it's pretty striking that the U.S. is 3.8 billion of that 5 billion. And when you look at the other regions, they're pretty minuscule. And that includes this $937 million from India, which frankly is tied to a Supreme Court case that makes payment for forest impacts, which is kind of a newfounded compensation approach in India that is money not been spent. So it's arguable whether that is even part of an offset. I think it is, but the point being that there really is tremendous room for growth in other regions other than the U.S. And one of the big points here is through regulatory certainty and policy dynamics, there's a real opportunity to leverage private capital. And I think the report reflects that there's about $1.1 billion in unspent investment capital sitting on the sidelines, ready to put to use in this context, but they need clear policy dynamics to support this. So the next slide may get to the heart of that. So in my way of looking at this, and you heard from Jen that 99 regulations in 33 different countries, Bebop has also suggested that there's now up to 100 countries that are considering some form of biodiversity offset policy. That includes no net loss, biodiversity net gain, or some form of positive impact that gets defined by those policies. But the reality of it is that you see that $3.8 billion reflected in the U.S. primarily because there is regulatory certainty. And that certainty allows private investment, it allows replicability, it allows scalability. And I think that is kind of the theme that we've seen over and over in these markets. There is reference in the report to some voluntary activity to date, but a lot of that voluntary activity is what we call pre-compliance, where there's been a regulatory signal that suggests that a hammer is coming down and that the pre-compliance work is in an effort to address some of that potential anticipated regulation. Next slide. In addition, I think it's important, really interesting to note here about these, what we call permittee responsible mitigation, or otherwise known as bespoke mitigation in other contexts. All the information, a lot of the data that the report reflects is from mitigation banks. And we think the rivets, as Jen mentioned, in the U.S. is a key transparent tool that will kind of enlighten folks about the number of banks, which we think are over 1,400 at this point, that in the U.S. alone, and it talks about the credits, and that basically has all of the underlying information associated with those banks. But in our view, it's over 60% of the marketplace is in this PRM context, or the permittee responsible context. And there's a real lack of transparency of the volume of what that really is. And that includes around the world, as Jen mentioned. So when you think about total value of this market, estimated to be close to 4.8 billion, it may be closer to 10 billion when you really think through this, at least relative to the U.S. Market, knowing that about 60% of the market is PRM. So transparency is really, really important, a theme that we'll continue to push, and you heard it from Jen. Next slide, please. The other kind of noteworthy issue that I see out of this is that compensation funds, or we call them in lieu fees in the United States. Some $1.2 billion between India and the U.S. alone has been collected. And then there's $7.1 billion that has been unspent. And to us, having been in the industry for over 20 years, to me, this is one of the biggest issues and problems that we have in this space. I think it's a dangerous concept because the reality is people think that good things are happening when monies are being collected. But most of the times we're seeing some real impediments to having real on-the-ground commitments. And the fact that $7.1 billion has been unspent in the fee construct tells you a lot. And as Jen mentioned, there are fixes, but there's better ways to go about it, which is why wouldn't we just promote on-the-ground solutions at the time of the impact? Why do we create a delay where money's put into repositories and then delayed, and then there's questions about whether the money's even spent appropriately? And I think the U.S. federal mitigation rule really was driving at that issue. We had years of really inappropriate in lieu fee constructs. And there was a general accounting office that came down and said there was massive money collected. Monies were often used for purposes other than offsets. Monies were often not being spent. Monies were sometimes used to balance governments' budgets for other reasons. And with the point being that the rule basically said there's a real preference for on-the-ground commitments, in particular banks, which have advanced solutions prior to the impacts. And that's why in the federal mitigation rule, there's a lot of effort to level the playing field to get away from the compensation fund. One other note, we're still having issues, even though the federal rule came out in 2008. We're still having issues with in-lieu feed programs, and recently the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers suspended an in-lieu feed program in Alaska because of lack of delivery. So even where there's a set of rules that create parameters, it takes a long time for the system to recognize this before suspension takes place. Why not just promote policy in the first instance for on-the-ground offset solutions? Next slide. Another point is what we call standard operating procedures in the U.S. Others may call it offset methodologies, but I think we use a lot of the terms no net loss, biodiversity net gain, and then the question is, and we define those, but you still have to define them relative to the conservation strategies in the region you're in. So how do you quantify that ecological uplift to show that it's a no net loss? So what's really important and essential for the marketplace is having this measurement of a unit on both the debit and credit side of the ledger. And when I mean debit, I mean the impact side of the ledger. A lot of times people only spend time saying, should we have a unit of measurement for the credit side? Well, if you do, you've got to have that same unit of measurement for the debit side, but it is essential in terms of allowing project developers, allowing those who impact to know what kind of crediting and debiting dynamics are going to be in place. And that includes things like functional wetland acres or habitat quantification tools or stream protocols. So it goes to Jen's point, which is you can create the policies, but then within that, you often need guidance. And this is one of the big points that is necessary. Even in the US, we still have over half of the states that don't have protocols for stream mitigation offsets. And even though it's required by the federal mitigation rule, many states have been dilatory in creating that, and that ends up promoting ad hoc solutions. And the point here is this unit of measurement for offsets allows for private investment in the concept of banking. And it allows you to leverage that private capital that we talked about earlier. Next slide. Another point is I think a lot of emerging markets and newfound no net loss or biodiversity net gain policies in other regions of the world tend to look at public lands as a kind of a source of an offset solutions. And I think it's really important that we recognize the concept of additionality because many public lands are already protected for conservation purposes. And too often what we're seeing is an over-reliance on public lands for offset solutions. And by doing that, you actually undermine using private lands because oftentimes public lands are for free. And so the offset solution doesn't take into account the monetary value of the use of that public land. In addition, if you're already dedicating that public land for conservation purposes, such as a park or otherwise, any maintenance and other type of activity should be funded through the standard legislative appropriation process and not through offset programs. And I think this is a really big issue, particularly in emerging markets that we see over and over again. In the US, over 82% of the activities are on private lands at the moment. And that is really where we need to leverage these solutions. Next slide. Accountability, and Jen mentioned this. I mean, we've now got a host of policies, whether it's in the government level, or whether it's through the Equator Principles at the finance level, or through IFC Performance Standard 6, or through World Bank safeguards, or through net zero deforestation commitments by a variety of companies in the consumer context. What we're seeing though is it's all good and fine to have those standards and policies, but if you're not enforcing them, then they're meaningless. And and so the question I see and hear is there really lacks accountability. And part of that is transparency and a role that ecosystem marketplace can continue to play in shining the light on what's really being done now that these standards are being adopted. Are the financial industry that's a part of the Equator Principles really adopt? What are they doing in the adopted policies? What's going on with IFC and the Performance Standard 6? So I think it's really important that this play out more so, and I think this is one of the reasons why the U.S. market's been so successful. It's because there's rigorous not only performance bonds and enforcement standards applicable to those who undertake the mitigation solutions. Next slide, and I'm coming to the end here. Particularly in the U.S., I would say there's a lot of quibbling relative to what the technical standards are for an offset credit debit scenarios. And you can quibble on what is the right metric, but at the end of the day, we can't lose sight that and by the requirement of perpetuity in the U.S., we are protecting lands and levering private capital to protect lands throughout the country. And that's something that we can't lose sight of. And I think the report reflects that, and we ought to take note of that there's a lot of conservation that's happening aside from the debate on the technical side of the equation. So last slide, Jen. So in conclusion, I'd say there's a lot of momentum for these concepts. I think we need to be paying attention to the guidance of implementation that Jen mentioned, and the issue of accountability. What happens if you don't abide by this? Regulatory markets, in my way of thinking, are the key, and it's the key to unlocking private investment and replicability. And I think it's important to recognize that there is a real opportunity to leverage the dollars that we have through private investment. Guidance is a good starting point, but mandatory permit obligations is much preferred. As we mentioned, there's a lot of need for transparency, both on what is the PRM, bespoke mitigation, and/or general accountability. And then finally, we really shouldn't take the easy way out and just try to, in newfound programs, rely on compensation funds. We should really require on-the-ground solutions at the time of the impact, and that's a keystone from our vantage point. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. Wonderful job, Ecosystem Marketplace and Forest Trends, and we'll stand by for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, George. That was fantastic. So, this is Genevieve Bennett again. Unfortunately, Julia Baker of Balfour Beatty is continuing to have some sound difficulties. Her audio is just not working. So, what we're going to do is have my colleague Melissa Gallant, my co-author on the report, read some comments that Julia has prepared on Balfour Beatty's work as regards biodiversity mitigation and some of the opportunities and challenges that Julia sees in this space. So Melissa, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jen. So here we go. Balfour Beatty is a principal contractor supporting major clients with large infrastructure projects. Our net gain has been driven by a strong business case to first make the consent process for these projects more efficient, but secondly, and most importantly, generate better biodiversity outcomes from these large-scale projects. Our industry depends on natural resources, so every time a project results in net loss of biodiversity, we are effectively digging our own grave. So biodiversity net gain is simply essential, not just nice to have. Our options for avoidance can be limited because our projects are mostly upgrading existing infrastructure rather than building new. That said, we do follow the mitigation hierarchy as closely as possible and avoid habitat loss and damage where possible. When residual impacts remain and/or net gain is not possible, we look to biodiversity offsetting. But our approach to this is to engage local government and wildlife groups. These are the local experts of the landscape who know where the best opportunities for biodiversity are and what works and what doesn't work for biodiversity. This also ensures that our investment goes direct to our grassroots level of nature conservation organizations, but there are challenges with this approach, such as here in the UK, the offset market isn't really up and running. So there is a lot of upfront investment to engage potential offset providers and identify their projects that deliver net gain for an infrastructure project plus generate wider benefits. The offset market here in the UK is new and there's not the evidence base around how much an offset costs. Within industry, I always get asked, how much will biodiversity net gain cost me? We have rough budget allocations, but really need to refine this to give greater certainty to developers. Greater certainty means that developers will have greater reassurance in the process. In turn, this means they will be more likely to commit to bio net gain. So this report is incredibly interesting and a great step forward in terms of building all this evidence, which greatly helps us here in the UK and all of us new to this. So
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julia, for those comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia. Sorry again about your sound difficulties, and thank you, Melissa, for jumping in to save us. I wonder maybe we can start. We had a question for Julia, and Melissa's going to moderate the Q&A, but this one was really interesting, so I'm going to butt in. A question for Julia on what she anticipates as far as Brexit affecting mitigation frameworks in the UK, and Julia has responded to us over the chat. She says that's an interesting question. At the moment, the UK government has made a commitment, regardless of Brexit, to leave the environment in a better state for the next generation, and so they have made this promise regardless of Brexit. On top of that, we're seeing key government strategies on infrastructure projects include biodiversity net gain, which is incredibly exciting, and this is a much more effective driver than laws, having those key biodiversity strategies in place. With laws, developers have to do this, and so a lot of them drag their feet and kind of just do the minimum. But when you're talking about a required deliverable of a project, that's a completely different situation and very exciting.
Great, thanks. So we've got a couple of other questions coming in here as well. I guess just a good one to start off with here. We have a question about that report that both Jen and George mentioned, the one that states the $25 billion restoration economy in the United States. And could you cite the original report?
Jen, you want me to answer that? I can absolutely, bear with me. Happy to give a kind of a reference, hyperlink reference to you at Far Ecosystem Marketplace, and you guys can circulate if that made sense for all.
Great, yeah, and I think we could send out a link to folks to that original article as well.
But happy to do that, and it's obviously published in 2015, and it was drafted by Todd Bendor, University of North Carolina, with a host of others contributing authors.
Great, thanks, George. We've got a question on the methodology for the report. Jen, why are PRM projects considered part of the biodiversity market when no mitigation credit transactions have occurred?
Well, so in the report, we do track permittee responsible offsets in terms of activity and impact by land area, because we felt that that was really important to try to capture, how much kind of space these are taking up, or how much activity we see relative to third-party compensatory mitigation, like mitigation banks and compensation funds. I don't know that we really consider them part of the market or markets per se, in the sense that we don't attempt to really summarize the value of spending on permittee responsible mitigation globally. We did try to collect data on spending commitments and spending to date, but what we found was that it was really patchy. It wasn't really collected or tracked in a standardized way. And so we opted to sort of just hold it back and say, we just really don't know very much about how much is actually being spent. And I think that's definitely that would be a really nice kind of next step for research is to start to sort of shed some light on that. So we really can kind of compare it to other market mechanisms.
Great. We've got a question here about China's One Belt, One Road, the massive infrastructure investment that they are doing to kind of almost recreate a modern Silk Road throughout the region. And do either of you know how much interest there has been by the Chinese government in adopting biodiversity mitigation standards as part of that investment initiative?
That is a great question. I don't know. I don't, George, maybe you can shed some light on this. I've been reading about that a little bit, and as I understand it, it's still sort of a work in progress, figuring out how impacts will be managed there. I will say China has a long history of using compensation mechanisms to manage environmental impacts. So it would be really interesting to see if, biodiversity compensatory mitigation does end up being part of that planning process.
Jen, I would just add, for those, somebody that might be very helpful in that answer is Gretchen Daly at Stanford. She's working very actively with the Chinese government on natural capital solutions. And China wants to become the eco-civilization of the 21st century. There's a lot of compensation tools, and the question coming back to you, Jen, is, wasn't there a reference to why you didn't include some of the Chinese activity in the report?
Yes, actually, I will let Melissa field that question on tracking Chinese compensation mechanisms. Melissa?
Yes, so in previous financial statistic yearbooks that had been put out by the Chinese government, there had been a line stating the amount of revenue coming in for compensatory mitigation. And I believe it was maybe 2015 or 2016, the reporting standards changed, and so a number of smaller funds were kind of lumped together, so we couldn't get the exact amount that was being taken in for biodiversity compensation.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, it was in previous statistical yearbooks, compensation was more than $1 billion a year. So probably what's happening is quite significant, but we have a pretty conservative methodology. If we can't verify something, we don't report it. But we do include a footnote on that in the report. So if other people want to take a look and draw their own conclusions, they're welcome to.
So we've got another question here. This one is for you, George. You had mentioned a need for limiting the delay in mitigation to avoid payments languishing in general funds, and Jen, you mentioned that as well. Is there a spatial analog to that, or can offsets be dispersed around the country or around the globe, or must they be localized geographically the same way they should be localized in time?
I'll jump in, and Jen, you could join in as well. There are spatial limitations. The payments are made and the monies are supposed to be spent consistent with the rules that are set up for offsets. So that includes any rules relative to where you can create an offset for an impact. And most times in the U.S., obviously, there's a service area that's limited, either tied to a sub-watershed in the water context or a habitat context for species. So yes, there is a spatial component to that. As Jen mentioned, what we might need, to the extent folks feel the need for it, is a temporal limitation, which would say, if you collect those monies, they should be spent in a time certain, because a lot of this stuff has languished for years without money on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't know that I really have anything else to add there. And I think it is a challenge. Ecosystem Marketplace also tracks, for example, the carbon markets, and it really is an entirely different animal. A ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, no matter where it's being offset, and that's definitely not true with species or habitats, right? That it really needs to take place within sort of the ecologically relevant area, whether that's a habitat context, as George said, or within a watershed context. And I am mindful that George has to catch a plane now, so I think we will wrap up this webinar. Thank you, Julia, so much, and thank you, George, so much for joining us and for your great comments. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining us as well, and for your questions. I'm sorry for those of you who didn't have a question answered. We'll do our best to follow up with you after the webinar, and we will also be sending around a follow-up email with links to work that we've mentioned during this webinar, and a webinar recording as well once that's available in the next day or two. So everyone have a terrific week, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.